So moments ago, back in Washington, the House of Representatives began to receive a classified briefing on last weekend's military operation in Iran. Senators received their own briefing yesterday, which followed a press conference at the Pentagon held by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There, Hegseth credited President Trump for single-handedly creating the conditions to end the war.
President Trump directed the most complex and secretive military operation in history. And it was a resounding success, resulting in a ceasefire agreement and the end of the 12-day war. There's been a lot of discussion about what happened and what didn't happen. Step back for a second. Because of decisive military action, President Trump created the conditions to end the war, decimating, choose your word, obliterating, destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Some hyperbole there. The single most complex and successful military operation in history ignores D-Day, the bin Laden raid, and so many others. So, in a new piece for The Atlantic, our next guest poses this question. Why does the power to launch nuclear weapons rest with a single American? Staff writer Tom Nichols writes in part this. At this very moment, a small plastic card of top secret codes, the president's personal key to America's nuclear arsenal, is resting in one of President Donald Trump's pockets as he fixates on shows of dominance, fumes about enemies, real and perceived, and allows misinformation to sway his decision-making, all while regional wars simmer around the world. And Tom joins us now. Tom, we'll shift to Iran in just a moment, but let's start with your piece. I read it last night. It is chilling. I would not recommend others to read it right before bed. It is to walk us through a little bit of the history here, why this awesome power lies with one person and one person alone, and are there really any safeguards in place?
To answer the last question first, there aren't any safeguards in place because the system is designed that way. The system is not designed to prevent the president from acting. The system, as our editor-in-chief, Jeff Goldberg, notes in a piece in the same issue, has a bias toward action. And all of this is a function of the Cold War. When we had a massive nuclear arsenal, the Soviet Union had a massive nuclear arsenal, and what we were always expecting was that a crisis would escalate to a strike on the United States that would completely decapitate our leadership, wipe out our nuclear deterrent, obliterate our cities, and leave the president with just moments to act. And at that moment, you don't want the president to have to call 14 members of Congress and schedule a hearing and, make sure that the Senate parliamentarians okay with it and all of that. So the system, really, the entire nuclear infrastructure of the United States, that we have bombers, submarines, land-based missiles, that we have a single person in control, all of this comes from our experience during the Cold War, when everything was organized around protecting the United States from a massive attack, possibly by surprise, from the Soviet Union. It's set up that way. It's not a flaw. It's not a bug. It's a feature.
And as you and Jeff both wrote, there have been some close calls over the years. Now talk to us about, if you will, fix this power that in this moment, President Trump has in the current global setting, where we have seen more and more countries race to develop these weapons that seems to maybe just raise the threshold for danger.
Yeah, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry once said, when you talk about chilling quotes, he said he thinks a nuclear war is less likely, but the use of a nuclear weapon somewhere is now much more likely. And the thing the system isn't really built to deal with is a president who wants to use nuclear weapons first for any reason he chooses. All of this command and control was bounded by the existence of the Cold War. Every president knew that the key to hell that he carried in his pocket was there to protect the United States from a sudden attack. With the end of the Cold War and the change in the international situation, that's still a good reason to have one person in charge of nuclear retaliation. If Russia or China tomorrow decided, for whatever reason, to start attacking the United States, you'd still want one person being able to issue the order to retaliate. But what every president can do, including Trump and Biden and Obama before him, is use nuclear weapons at will for whatever reason. The first review that George W. Bush did on nuclear weapons included countries as possible targets that didn't even have nuclear weapons. And that is a problem. You know, the old Cold War system never really thought about what happens if a president decides he just wants to nuke, you know, somebody that's aggravating him, or that he may want to use nuclear weapons because he thinks it's the only way to get a job done.
Hi, Tom. It's Molly Johnfest. It's long been said that Trump 2.0 does not have grown-ups in the room, right? That there's a culture of sycophancy around the president. I wonder if you could speak to how that relates to this issue.
If the president wants to use nuclear weapons, the first thing we assume any president would do is to call his civilian and military advisors. And the problem, as you say, Molly, there aren't any grown-ups in the room. Pete Hegseth is not a real Secretary of Defense. He has no qualifications for it. He's in way over his head. As you saw it, his core competency is to stand behind the lectern and hector reporters, including his old colleagues. That's about the depth of he probably would have made a good press spokesman, but he shouldn't be Secretary of Defense. And at that moment, if President Trump says, I'm thinking of using a nuclear weapon, you want someone with the fortitude and the courage and the independent standing to say, look, we need to talk about this. You need to reconsider this. And there, with the possible exception of General Kane, it's difficult to imagine who in the room is going to say, let's think this through, Mr. President. Maybe this is a bad idea. Donald Trump, speaking of things that are a feature, not a bug, Donald Trump intentionally stacked his cabinet with yes men. He doesn't want to hear that again. He heard that kind of stuff in his first term, and he learned from it. And so there won't be anybody in the room who's going to say to him anything but, great idea, sir. And that's a problem.
Tom, I was thinking as you were talking about also the reporting in the last few years about Trump asking repeatedly, like, why haven't we used a nuclear weapon, and how terrifying those questions were to members of the Joint Chief in previous administrations. But I wanted to shift a little bit to Iran and this, you know, the sort of, as you said, Pete Hegseth trying to manage what is clearly something above his capability. You know, even for people who supported potentially the strike on Iran, it feels like the administration's just not willing to speak kind of honestly about even what's obvious, that we might not really know whether it was a success, whether the uranium had been moved, et cetera. What does the sort of press engagement and attacking from Hegseth say to you also about, in even a heightened, more extreme context, what might happen and what the Americans could expect?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what it really shows, every time I see Hegseth behind the podium or any of this national security team, what comes out of them to me is fear and insecurity. They're afraid of the boss, and they are deeply insecure, which is why they don't talk to the American public like grown-ups, like adults who would say, look, we did our best. We think we got most of it. We're still doing the assessment. With the exception of General Kane, who, as a career military person, says we have to do battle damage assessment. That takes a long time. You know, we're working on it. That instead, it's this constant kind of TV show, authoritarian bravado. We did it. We got him. It's over. That's not how the real world works. That's how TV works. And they don't understand that, or they don't want to understand it, because nuance, they feel like nuance and speaking like adults to millions of Americans makes them look weak.
And I think that's a tone set from the Oval Office. Staff writer at The Atlantic, Tom Nichols, thank you. His important and terrifying new piece online now.